Ophelia Dunmore fell asleep on my shoulder somewhere over Nebraska. At least I thought she did. I'm Weston Kellerman, 33, and Ophelia has lived across the hall from me for 2 years, an arrangement that had produced something considerably warmer than ordinary neighborly politeness. We watered each other's plants during vacations, split takeout on nights neither of us wanted to cook, had developed the specific, easy shorthand of two people who genuinely liked each other's company, without either of us ever pushing the friendship toward anything more. I hadn't expected her to be on the same flight to Denver that morning, mostly because in 2 years of living 40 feet apart, our lives had never once overlapped this precisely. But there she was at the gate, laptop bag over one shoulder, looking equally startled when she spotted me in the boarding line. "Weston, you're kidding." Apparently not. Small world, given we live across the hall and somehow ended up on the same flight. "I'm here for a conference. You?" "Site visit for a client. I didn't even know this route ran direct until my assistant booked it." Small world, or apparently a very predictable one, given how limited the flight options actually are out of our particular airport. I want to be honest about my own reaction in that moment. Standing in a boarding line I'd expected to spend entirely alone, headphones already in, mentally rehearsing a full flight of quiet work emails. Instead, I felt something considerably closer to relief, an unexpected pleasure at the prospect of 5 hours in her company instead of 5 hours of silence. We compared boarding passes, discovered we were seated several rows apart, and made the easy small talk of two people who knew each other well enough to skip past the awkward parts, catching up on building gossip and the specific ongoing saga of our building's temperamental elevator while we waited to board. 2 years of proximity had produced a specific, considerable intimacy. Neither of us had ever quite named. She had a spare key to my apartment for emergencies. I knew her coffee order well enough to have it ready during her worst mornings. We'd developed an entire private vocabulary of building-specific jokes that would have meant nothing to anyone else. I'd never once let myself examine too closely why all of that felt like considerably more than ordinary neighborly courtesy. There was a particular night, about a year into knowing her, that I still thought about more than I probably should have. A pipe had burst in her apartment at 2 in the morning, and she'd knocked on my door in pajamas, genuinely panicked, water already seeping under her threshold. I'd spent the next 3 hours helping her shop vac her living room and call an emergency plumber, and somewhere around hour 2, exhausted and soaked, she'd started laughing uncontrollably at the absurdity of the whole situation. And I remember thinking, with a clarity that had scared me enough to bury it immediately, that I could have spent every future 2 in the morning crisis exactly like that one, and still felt lucky. I never mentioned that thought to anyone. I certainly never mentioned it to her. There was another moment, too. Considerably more ordinary, but somehow just as significant in retrospect, a Sunday afternoon about 6 months later when she'd shown up at my door with a single slice of cake, insisting I try a recipe she'd been perfecting for a client presentation. We'd ended up spending the entire afternoon on my couch, working through 3 additional recipe variations together, both of us offering increasingly ridiculous feedback about frosting consistency. And I remember the specific, uncomplicated happiness of that afternoon, lingering considerably longer than the cake itself did. We ended up seated together by pure coincidence, a middle seat swap with a stranger who seemed genuinely delighted to trade for an aisle. The flight settled into its ordinary rhythm quickly, both of us pulling out laptops for the first hour, exchanging occasional comments about work before falling into a comfortable quiet somewhere over Illinois. 2 hours into the flight, somewhere over the Midwest, Ophelia's head found my shoulder, her breathing slowing into the specific rhythm of someone who'd actually fallen asleep rather than just resting her eyes. I sat carefully still, unwilling to disturb her, watching the seatback screen with considerably less attention than the movie playing on it deserved. I sat there for the better part of an hour, careful not to move, watching the clouds through the window while she slept, turning over a feeling I'd been carefully not naming for most of those 2 years. I thought about the specific accumulated evidence of it, the way I'd started timing my own grocery runs around the chance of running into her in the hallway, the fact that I'd turned down a promotion that would have meant relocating, telling myself it was about the job itself, rather than anything to do with not wanting to leave a particular floor of a particular building. Somewhere around hour 3, apparently emboldened by the assumption that she was genuinely unconscious, I said the thing out loud, quiet enough that I fully believed it would stay just between me and the recycled cabin air. I wish you knew how much I've wanted to tell you. She didn't move for a long moment. Then, without lifting her head from my shoulder, she whispered back, I heard everything you said. I felt my entire chest go cold, the specific vertigo of a private thought suddenly, catastrophically public. How long have you been awake? Since somewhere around Chicago. I got comfortable and didn't want to move. And then you started talking, and I genuinely didn't know how to interrupt without making it strange. That's considerably more strange than if you just interrupted. Probably. I panicked. She finally sat up, meeting my eyes directly for the first time since this entire mortifying situation had started, straightening her hair with a hand that wasn't entirely steady. Did you mean it, what you said? I want to be honest about my own internal state in that moment, because it matters for the rest of this story. There was no version of this conversation where lying convincingly was actually available to me. I meant it. I've meant it for longer than I probably should have kept quiet about, honestly. How long is longer? Around a year, if I'm being fully honest. I kept telling myself the timing was never right, or that saying something would risk the version of you I already had, the neighbor, the friend, the person who waters my plants, for a version that might not exist at all. I've been having a nearly identical internal argument for about the same length of time, apparently. I just never got careless enough to fall asleep and let it slip. Here's what you need to know about Ophelia Dunmore before anything else happens. She works in product design, had lived in our building for just over 2 years, and had, according to what she told me over the remainder of that flight, spent most of the past year developing an elaborate internal case for why nothing should ever happen between us. Chief among the arguments being the genuine terror of losing a friendship that had become one of the steadiest things in her life. I actually made a list once, she admitted, somewhere over Iowa. Reasons not to say anything. It's genuinely embarrassing how thorough it was. Number 1 was some version of you'll ruin the only reliable good thing in your current life. Number 4 was he's never given you any actual indication he feels the same way, which apparently turned out to be spectacularly wrong. I could have saved you the trouble of numbers 2 and 3, apparently, if I'd just said something 18 months ago instead of pretending no one could hear me and letting it slip by accident. I don't think either of us gets credit for actual courage here, honestly. This was pure accident, start to finish. I don't want to lose the easy version of this, she continued, somewhere over Nebraska. If we try this and it goes badly, I don't just lose whatever this could become. I lose the person who knows exactly how I take my coffee and always remembers to bring my mail in when I'm traveling. I've had that same fear on repeat for months. I don't have a clean solution for it, except to say I don't think either of us wants to spend the next several years of hallway small talk wondering what would have happened if we'd actually said something. What actually convinced you to keep quiet for a year? I'm curious about the specific mechanics of your own restraint, given mine apparently produced an entire itemized list. Mostly the same fear, articulated less formally. Every time I got close to saying something, I'd picture the specific, considerable awkwardness of us running into each other in the hallway for the next several years after a rejection. I convinced myself the risk wasn't worth the comfortable thing I already had, even though the comfortable thing was apparently eating at me more than I let myself admit. That's a very rational-sounding way to describe pure cowardice. I'll allow the characterization. It's accurate. That's a fair point, though I'll note the saying something part happened by accident, not by either of our actual courage. I contain multitudes, apparently, including the specific accidental courage that only shows up when I've convinced myself no one's listening. We talked for the remainder of the flight, the specific unguarded conversation that comes naturally once the hardest thing has already, accidentally been said. She told me about her actual career ambitions, a design studio she'd been quietly dreaming about launching independently someday. Details I'd never once heard in 2 years of hallway small talk. I told her about my own quiet dissatisfaction with the corporate side of my consulting work, a frustration I'd apparently been keeping to myself as thoroughly as she'd kept her feelings. By the time we landed, we'd agreed, carefully, to actually try, slowly, without rushing past the 2 years of genuine friendship that had gotten us here. I want to be clear about something important, because it matters for how the rest of this story unfolds. We didn't rush anything past that flight. Both conferences, as it turned out, ran through the same week, and we ended up sharing occasional dinners between our separate work obligations, both of us treating the new territory with the specific care two people bring to something they genuinely don't want to break. Our first dinner alone, the evening after we'd landed, carried a specific charged quiet neither of our usual hallway conversations had ever produced. We'd chosen a quiet restaurant near her hotel, both of us dressed slightly more deliberately than the occasion strictly required, both of us aware that whatever this was had already shifted considerably from ordinary neighborly dinner. "This feels different from our usual takeout nights," she observed once we'd been seated. "Considerably different. Though I'll admit the nervousness feels almost funny, given we've had actual keys to each other's apartments for over a year. I keep waiting for it to feel awkward. It doesn't, though. It just feels like us, with slightly higher stakes attached." I'll take slightly higher stakes over actual awkwardness. Seems like a reasonable trade. We talked for hours that evening, covering ground 2 years of hallway small talk had somehow never quite reached: her actual family history, my own complicated relationship with an overachieving older brother, the specific parallel loneliness of two people who'd each built comfortable, solitary routines without fully examining whether comfortable was the same as fulfilled. Everything complicated on the third evening, when Ophelia's coworker, a friendly, confident man named Derek, who was also attending her conference, joined us for dinner and spent most of the meal building towards something considerably more significant than the ordinary professional camaraderie I'd initially assumed I was watching. "I've been meaning to bring this up properly," he told her, somewhere around the second course. "The studio idea. I've got investors interested. Actual ones this time, not just conversation. Portland office space, 18-month runway, creative direction split between us. I want you as a founding partner, Ophelia. Not eventually. Now." I watched her face change. Genuine, uncomplicated excitement of the kind I'd only ever seen her display when talking about the design studio she'd been quietly dreaming about for as long as I'd known her. The exact dream she'd described to me on the plane 4 days earlier, apparently already sitting in someone else's fully funded business plan. "Portland," she repeated. "Portland. I know it's a move, but you've been talking about this for 3 years, and this is genuinely the version where it actually happens." I felt the floor shift considerably under that sentence. This wasn't a man flirting over dinner. This was a man offering her the specific future she'd spent years wanting, packaged with a relocation that would end the 2 years of shared hallway that had produced everything between us. 4 days earlier. "You've gone quiet," Ophelia observed, once Derek had finally excused himself to take a call. "Fine, just processing." It wasn't entirely honest, and I suspected she could tell. "You've been staring at your water glass since he said Portland." I want to be honest about my own insecurity in that moment, because it matters for the rest of this story. I'm trying to figure out how to be genuinely happy for you about something that might mean losing you 3 days after I finally admitted anything. Those two feelings apparently don't coexist as gracefully as I'd like. It's a considerable offer, Weston. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't tempted. You should be tempted. It's the thing you've wanted for 3 years. I'd think considerably less of you if you weren't. And us? Where does whatever happened on that plane sit inside that decision? I don't know yet. I think that's a question you have to actually answer for yourself, without me weighting the scale by asking you to stay. If I ask you to turn down a founding partnership 4 days into something new, I'm not sure either of us trusts the version of us that comes out the other side. She was quiet for a long moment. That's a genuinely difficult thing to say out loud. It was. I nearly said something considerably more selfish instead. The remaining 3 days of that conference carried a weight neither of us had anticipated, both of us circling a decision that had arrived considerably faster than either of us was prepared for. I watched Derek pitch her further over the following days, additional meetings, spreadsheets, an actual investor call she was invited to sit in on, and felt the specific helplessness of a man watching someone he'd just found get handed a genuinely good reason to leave. I caught myself once, halfway through forming the words, "Maybe you should give her some space," and stopped, understanding clearly that the decision wasn't mine to make on her behalf. "You almost said something to him at the reception," Ophelia mentioned that evening, watching me with visible curiosity. "I saw your face." "I did. I stopped myself, though." "What were you going to say?" "Something considerably more possessive than I actually have the right to be, given we've been officially anything for exactly 4 days. I'm working on the difference between caring and controlling. It's apparently a steeper learning curve than I expected. I appreciate the self-awareness, even mid-almost mistake." We flew home together at the end of that week, the Portland question still entirely unresolved between us. And I want to tell you about the blanket, because it matters for how this story ends. Somewhere over the return flight, Ophelia fell asleep against my shoulder again, this time entirely genuinely, and I draped the thin airline blanket over her without thinking much of it. A small automatic gesture that felt, in the moment, like nothing more than ordinary care. I spent a good portion of that return flight simply watching her sleep, the specific quiet satisfaction of a week that had started with genuine mortification and ended somewhere considerably more complicated than either of us had anticipated at the outset. She stirred once, briefly, mumbling something incoherent before settling back into sleep, and I found myself staring at the seat back in front of me, wondering whether I was watching the beginning of something or simply the last comfortable hours before it ended. She took 11 days to decide about Portland. 11 days I deliberately stayed out of, telling her clearly that I wouldn't weight the decision by asking her to stay. It was, honestly, the hardest restraint I've ever managed. I saw her in the hallway during that stretch, exchanged the ordinary neighborly pleasantries we'd traded for 2 years, and never once brought up the only subject either of us was actually thinking about. She knocked on my door on the 12th evening, still holding a laptop open to what appeared to be an unsent email. "I turned it down," she said without preamble. "Not because of you. I want to be genuinely clear about that because I need you to believe it." I spent 11 days actually examining what I wanted, and I realized the Portland version of that studio was Derek's dream with my name attached to it. Founding partner, sure, but his investors, his timeline, his creative direction with mine as a supporting piece. I've been dreaming about building something that's actually mine, not becoming the second name on someone else's letterhead. That's a genuinely significant distinction. I'm glad you found it in 11 days instead of 11 months into the actual job. There's a second thing, though, and I want to say it out loud, even though it's harder. She set the laptop down. You not asking me to stay mattered considerably more than if you had. If you'd asked, I think I'd have spent years wondering whether I turned it down for the right reasons. You gave me the room to actually choose, and I chose staying anyway. That's a version I can trust. She kept that blanket. I found out weeks later, once we were properly, officially dating, that she'd folded it into her carry-on rather than leaving it on the seat, apparently deciding it deserved a place beyond the ordinary disposability of airline linens. "You kept that?" I asked once, catching sight of it tucked into a drawer in her apartment. "I did. I don't fully know why, except that it felt like proof something significant had actually happened twice on the same specific journey. I didn't want to lose the evidence. That's either very sentimental or a mild form of airline theft. I'm choosing to interpret it as sentimental. I'll allow either interpretation, given how well the outcome actually turned out. Back home, in the ordinary geography of our shared hallway, the specific awkwardness we'd both feared never actually materialized. Instead, we fell into an easy pattern of seeing each other considerably more than 2 years of neighborly politeness had ever produced. Actual dates, deliberate conversations about the future instead of just borrowed sugar and watered plants, the specific slow building of something neither of us wanted to rush. Our first actual date, distinct from a week of conference dinners and accidental confessions, happened about 2 weeks after we'd landed, both of us slightly nervous in a way that felt almost funny given everything we'd already been through together. "This is strange," Ophelia admitted, as I picked her up properly, walking the considerable distance of 40 feet from her door to mine. "2 years of knowing you, and I'm somehow nervous about a dinner reservation 3 blocks from our own building." "I feel the same, honestly. I think it's because this time we both know exactly what's actually at stake, instead of just running on airplane adrenaline and a lucky accident." We spent that evening laughing our way through dinner, both of us discovering, with genuine delight, an entirely new register of a friendship that had first started 2 years earlier and never quite finished evolving. She told me about the elaborate list of reasons she'd apparently drafted against ever saying anything, and I told her, in return, about the promotion I'd quietly turned down specifically to avoid moving away from her floor. "You actually turned down a promotion? Over me? Without either of us having said a single word to each other about any of this?" In my defense, I told myself at the time it was purely a career decision. I've since revised that assessment considerably. That's either deeply romantic or a genuinely concerning level of self-deception. I'm choosing to be flattered rather than concerned. We spent that first month establishing an easy rhythm neither of us had expected to find so naturally, given how much of it simply built on 2 years of established routine, quiet dinners that alternated between our two apartments, weekend errands run together instead of separately, both of us discovering, gradually, that the actual transition from friends to something more required considerably less adjustment than either of us had anticipated. "I keep expecting some dramatic shift," Ophelia told me about 3 weeks in. "Some moment where everything suddenly feels different. It hasn't really happened. It just feels like an extension of what we already had, with better kissing." I'll take the compliment buried in that observation. It was absolutely a compliment. I don't hand those out carelessly. We told our closest friends about a month in, both of us curious how the news would land, given how thoroughly our respective social circles had already absorbed us as a package deal for 2 years running. "Finally," my closest friend Marcus said with visible exasperation upon hearing the news, "I've been listening to you talk about your neighbor for 2 years without you once admitting what was actually obvious to literally everyone else in your life." Was it that obvious? "Weston, you once spent 40 minutes describing, in genuine detail, how she reorganizes her spice rack. That's not neighborly small talk. That's a man who's been quietly obsessed for a considerable stretch of time." "I keep waiting for this to feel complicated," Ophelia admitted about 2 months in, both of us on my couch after an ordinary Tuesday dinner. "Given everything, it just doesn't, though. It feels remarkably simple, which almost makes me more nervous than if it felt hard. Maybe simple is allowed to just be simple sometimes, especially after 2 years of unnecessary complication getting us here." I like that framing. I'm choosing to believe it, at least for tonight. I want to be honest about what happened next, because it's the part of this story I've replayed most since. Sitting on that couch, I reached for her hand, and the kiss that followed started careful. The particular carefulness of two people who'd spent 2 years building toward exactly this moment without either of us rushing the landing. Then it went warm, her hand finding the front of my shirt with a certainty that erased whatever remaining hesitation either of us carried. And then, for one long, unhurried moment, it went past warm entirely, into something that made my ordinary living room feel like exactly the right place for 2 years of missed hallway opportunity to finally resolve itself. We broke apart to the sound of my own doorbell, an unplanned delivery neither of us had ordered correctly, both of us laughing at the mundane comedy of the timing. "For the record," I said, "I'm glad you were actually awake on that flight." Best accidental confession of my entire life, evidently. We dated properly for the following year, both of us deliberate about building something real out of what had started as an accidental whisper 30,000 feet in the air. Around the 8-month mark, we made the practical decision most couples in our specific situation eventually face: whether to combine our 2 apartments into one, given we already spent nearly every night in the same unit regardless. It seems financially absurd to keep paying for 2 apartments when we're only actually using one on any given night, Ophelia observed, with her usual pragmatic directness. Deeply unromantic way to frame a significant relationship milestone, but accurate. I contain both romance and financial pragmatism in roughly equal measure. You'll have to get used to both. We moved into her apartment together shortly after, mine given up for a considerably smaller storage unit's worth of furniture we couldn't quite bring ourselves to part with. The transition felt less like a dramatic life change and more like formalizing something that had already been quietly true for months, both of us discovering that combining 2 already compatible lives required considerably less adjustment than either of us had braced for. I proposed on a flight to the same destination, on the anniversary of that original trip, holding a ring and the same worn blanket she'd kept folded in her carry-on for the occasion. I'd coordinated with the airline weeks in advance, an oddly complicated process involving several phone calls and a genuinely confused customer service representative to make sure we'd be seated in roughly the same section of the plane where everything had actually started. "This seat number looks familiar," Ophelia observed once we'd settled in, studying her boarding pass with visible confusion. "It should," I called ahead. "Consider it a deliberate recreation. You called an airline to arrange specific seating for sentimental reasons?" I contain multitudes, apparently, including a surprising capacity for logistics in service of romantic gestures. Somewhere over the same stretch of Nebraska where she'd first admitted to her elaborate list of reasons against saying anything, I reached into my bag and produced both the blanket and the ring. "You brought the blanket," she said, once she'd recovered from the surprise of the ring itself, tears already gathering. I thought the story deserved to close its own loop properly. Same flight path, same blanket, considerably less accidental this time. "This feels appropriately full circle." That was very much the intention. She said yes before I'd even finished the full question, laughing and crying simultaneously in the exact same general airspace where an accidental whisper had first turned into something considerably more significant than either of us had anticipated. We got married the following spring, small and unhurried, exactly the way we'd built everything else between us, in a backyard ceremony that neither of us wanted to make bigger than it needed to be. Ophelia's parents, meeting me properly for the first time months earlier, had greeted the news with the specific warm amusement of people who'd apparently been quietly hoping for exactly this outcome. "She's mentioned you in nearly every phone call for 2 years, her mother told me at that first dinner. I started keeping a mental tally of how often your name came up relative to actual news about her own life. It was a considerable margin, in retrospect. I had no idea I featured that prominently. Neither did she, apparently, until an airplane forced the issue. I'm glad it finally did. My sister, who'd heard the full story secondhand more times than she probably wanted to, gave a brief toast that mostly consisted of teasing me for my apparent inability to say anything important without first believing no one was listening. "I want it on the record," she said, glass raised, "that my brother has never once said anything genuinely vulnerable to another human being while fully conscious of being heard. Ophelia, you married a man who needed an entire airplane and a false sense of privacy just to admit he liked you. I hope you find that as endearing as the rest of us apparently do." "I'm choosing to interpret that as a compliment about my hidden depths," I told the assembled guests, "rather than an accurate assessment of my emotional availability." "Both can be true," Ophelia said, laughing. "I've made my peace with both." She launched her own studio about a year after the wedding, entirely hers this time. Her investors, her timeline, her creative direction, with no one else's name ahead of it on the letterhead. I watched her build it the same way she'd built everything else, methodically and without panic, and thought more than once about the version of that dream she'd turned down on a hotel bed in Denver and how completely right she'd been to wait for one that was actually her own. The blanket sits framed now in our shared apartment, a small, permanent record of exactly how much can change in the time it takes someone to fall asleep on your shoulder and hear something you never meant for them to hear. I think back sometimes to that specific accident, 30,000 feet over Nebraska, the particular courage that only ever showed up in me once I'd convinced myself no one was listening. I don't know if I'd have ever said anything otherwise, given 18 months of careful, deliberate silence before that flight. Sometimes the truest things only escape once you've stopped guarding them quite so carefully. Have you ever accidentally said the thing you'd been too scared to say on purpose? Tell me your story in the comments. If you liked this one, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.